And good morning. I'm Carol Waters. I'm the County Director for Extension at ISU Extension Outreach in West Pottawatomie. And this is Infield Friday with Kit Tovar. She is with the Center for Ag Law and Taxation. And we really appreciate you coming and joining us today, Kit.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. I am going to try to share my screen. Get this all set up. Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, today we're going to be talking about Iowa fence law. This is a very popular topic that we get a lot of questions about at the center. Even with everything that's going on with the virus, we still have been getting calls about this. So I thought this might be a great time to kind of review it. Hopefully this is something people don't have to deal with, but it seems like it's something that comes up eventually, so we'll go over it today. So I have my contact information up here. Like Carol said, my name is Kit Tovar. I'm the staff attorney at the Center for Ag Law and Tax. I have my email up here if you guys have questions after watching this, or about fence law or about other topic areas, you guys can feel free to reach out. I also have our website up here. We have a lot of different information for producers, bankers. If you guys have any agriculture tax issues, we've probably written about it, so feel free to check us out. Then just real quick, we have to give our disclaimer that this isn't legal advice, that, that this is more of an academic informational session. So this is, if you guys do have questions, feel free to reach out, but we can also point you into the direction of an attorney if you guys need that, but that is that. So then to get started today, what I want to go over today is a few different things. I want to go over the background of Iowa's fence law. It really makes sense for why we have the law today that way we do. I want to talk about what it is. It's a lot of technical requirements. And then I'm going to go over some laws and cases that have come up over Iowa fence law's very long history, just because I think it makes sense to understand what other people have gone through. Maybe if you're in a situation with a fence dispute, we can talk about that. And I think it's very good illustrative examples. And then we'll talk about more of the technical requirements that come with fence law. There's a lot, it's kind of a wordy statute, so we'll go over some of this, and hopefully if you guys have questions, feel free to let me know or email me later. So just as a quick background, so Iowa's fencing statute, it is older than the state of Iowa itself. It is authorized by territorial legislation. So it's been around for quite a long time. And if you're from Iowa, or if you lived in Iowa a long time, you've probably heard of it. If you are from out of state or have lived somewhere else for a little bit, maybe it strikes you as kind of funny what it is. I'm from Wisconsin originally, and we do not have this. So it is definitely something that's very Iowan. And that is why I love this quote that I have at the bottom, where it says, this is from one of the Supreme Court cases we're going to talk about in a little bit. And it says, "It is difficult to imagine a more deeply rooted Iowa statutory provision." That, you know, this law it's very old, and it comes from a time when fencing was really encouraged because of the way, you know, farms were much smaller. Almost every farm had livestock, they're more diversified. So fencing was just so important. And farming today is a lot different than farming what it was in the 1800s, obviously, but it's still stuck around, and it's a very Iowan thing. So with that, we'll talk about what is Iowa fence law. And basically it creates this duty to build a partition fence in certain circumstances. So it is important to note that Iowa landowners, they don't have a duty to fence their property just because. What the Iowa law does is that it imposes a conditional statutory duty. So this means that there's only certain circumstances that you have to do this. And basically what that means is that when two neighbors of adjoining land, if either one of them has a written request to build a partition fence, so that just means a boundary fence, a fence on the boundary line, the other landowner has to build and maintain that fence and keep it up in good shape. So basically the law is that if you or your neighbor, so let's say you want to build a partition fence, the Iowa law can require your neighbor to help contribute to the cost or to build half of it. So that's kind of an interesting idea. And as you can see, some people might really like that if they would like a fence. Some people might not like that as much if they are, don't want the fence. And that is where we get some tension. I know that some people, there's no requirement for you, if you would like a partition fence, if you want a fence on the boundary line, you do not have to work with your neighbor. Some people, they'd rather just do it themselves, not deal with it. Other people, neighbors love this. Then they have something, they have a codified rule of what they have to do. And so some neighbors like this and this works great for them each to share. But then of course, we have some neighbors that do not like this and there's a little tension and headbutting. So we'll get to that. But basically, how do you start this? Let's say an individual wants to put this partition fence up. There isn't one. What do you do? So you have to first do a written request to your neighbor. So this means that you can't just verbally won't work. Obviously, practically, starting things off like by a nice conversation is the best way to go. But legally, what the Iowa code requires is that you say something like, dear neighbor, please help me build this fence. There's no necessarily magic words, but this is what people do, and this is how this is how it would work to start off this idea of the partition fence sharing. So if you're watching this and you're not a livestock owner, you're kind of thinking, is this really fair? Can they do this? And this has to be just for livestock, right? No one can make me build a fence if I don't want to. And that's actually not true. So it doesn't matter if one landowner has no livestock, they can still ask their neighbor to build the fence and maintain this fence on the partition line. And on the opposite, if you do own livestock and your neighbor does not, you can still require that neighbor without livestock contributes to the fence. So it really doesn't have anything to do with livestock. And obviously when we're talking about the partition fence, that's the boundary fence. This isn't a corral or something that's on your property. It has to be on the boundary line. So that's what makes this a little different, and that's why neighbors have to help out. So when we're looking at this, we're talking about, we also have to bring up fence viewers. And some of you may have heard that term, some of you may have not. We'll talk a little bit more about who they are and what they do in a little bit. But basically the fence viewers are the township trustees. There's usually 3 or 5 of them. And what they do, if there is a dispute, they'll come out and make sure that the cost and burden are shared equally. Because that's kind of the purpose of this law, is that we want to encourage fencing and we want to encourage neighbors to contribute equally. So a lot of times what has happened traditionally when neighbors are trying to figure this out, they'll work it out amongst themselves and they'll do what's called the right-hand rule. So this isn't actually in the Iowa code anywhere, but traditionally what happens in on the farm in real life, what people are doing. And what this is that two landowners will stand in the middle of the fence and kind of face each other. And one landowner, they will decide, I'll take care of the right half. So I'll take care of all the fencing to my right. So this right half, and the other landowner will look at standing in the middle, will look and take care of the other right. So his right. And this is something that, well, like I said, it's not codified anywhere or in Iowa law. The Iowa courts have let it go if this is the agreement. So it seems to work for a lot of people, and that's what they like to do. However, I will say that if, depending on where you are, if you're in, maybe the western part of the state, this might not work because half the fence might not necessarily be half the cost. If you're in central Iowa, north central is a little flatter, maybe than the western side of the state or the eastern side of the state. This is where you have to maybe, you think more about the cost and the burden than actually physically half. So that's kind of the difference that I think people should remember. It's not just half. If we'll talk about different issues that come up, because very rarely it seems like it's just this perfectly located boundary line where it's flat, there's nothing in the way. So it's all about equalizing the cost and the burden. That's what the statute requires, not just physically half the fence. So as old as this law is, there has been some updates to it in the as recently as 2018. And in 2018, their Iowa legislature, they created a new law that allowed fence viewers to, after coming out in a fence dispute, they can determine that a boundary fence is what's called unfeasible. And that determination can be based on any of these following factors. So I'll go through them real quick. And that can be, a fence can be infeasible because of topography, the terrain, terraces, if there's land sloping, unstable ground, different water issues, easements, utilities, and available area. We haven't had any cases on this since the law is so new, but I did have a phone call a couple months ago that was kind of very similar to this, where a farmer, his neighbor had requested that he build this partition fence, a boundary fence with him. And the person who called me, he seemed like he was willing to go along with it because he knew that this was a law that, he was kind of forced to follow. But the issue is that he was in one of the federal programs, I think he was working with FSA, to grow pine trees. And some of the boundary line, putting that fence in would have made him have to cut down several of these trees that he could not because of the contract he had with the federal government. So in that case, while I would think that this would not be allowed, that he does not have to, this would be an unfeasible fence because of the program that he is in, this farmer's in, he cannot cut down trees unless, I think there's an exception, like if the tree gets sick and is dying or something like that. But that, that was not the case here. So that would be an easement. There would be some thing that I would guess that if he cannot do that, that would be an unfeasible fence. So there can be things like that. And you guys can all think of, if you can't always put a fence in if there's some type of waterway or something like that, there can be a lot of different reasons that might not work. So this was a rule that just, came out in 2018. And what happens then? So if, let's say, the fence viewers determine that where the boundary line is and where the fence is supposed to go, that's not feasible. So they're going to ask the parties, the two neighbors, to agree on an alternate. They're going to try to get the two parties to work it out on themselves. But we all know that sometimes that might not work, that people, just can't get along. So if the two neighbors cannot agree within 60 days, the fence viewers are going to order the fence be placed at the most feasible location on the property of the owner who initiated the controversy. So that means that in that previous example I was talking about, the person who asked for the fence to be built, that fence is going to have to be pushed a little bit onto their land. So they're going to lose a little property. And, it kind of makes sense. It's unfair to require someone to build a fence and lose land, because if they're the ones who didn't initiate it. So that hasn't come up a lot, but that is a newer law that I wanted to let people know about. And you can see how that could be something that happens quite a bit with different Iowa terrain. There is one, kind of caveat warning I want to give you guys about that though, and we won't talk too much about this, but we do get calls a lot about what's called, it's in fancy legalese, it's called boundary by acquiescence. And it's kind of similar to adverse possession, if you all have heard of that, where boundary by acquiescence is that if a fence or some type of line is treated like the boundary for at least 10 years by both parties, that becomes the new boundary line. So if you put the fence in an area and you think it's the boundary, and both parties think it's the boundary line, but some of these surveys that were done a long, long time ago aren't always the most accurate. it can make that the fence be put, it can lead to the fence being put on the wrong area. So that's why on one hand, if you're buying new property, make sure you get a survey done. On the other, make sure you get a fence agreement or something like that you are acknowledging that this fence is put here just because it's not feasible to put it anywhere else, not because this is the new boundary line. So that's just something that might come up. If it's just important to, I don't know, be aware of these things. There's always little issues that can come up. So the Iowa Code goes on, and now that we've talked about what the fence law is, requiring neighbors to help contribute to the fence, they also talk about what types of fences are even allowed. So Iowa Code, they list 6 different options, and it's kind of wordy, and I won't read it to you. But what it starts off saying is that there's some of them are more basic. You can have a fence of 3 weight rails, a fence of 3 boards, 3 barbed wires. They have some more technical allowable lawful fences. And then finally, number 6, if you can see it, is that a lawful fence can be any other kind of fence which the fence viewers consider to be the equivalent to a lawful fence. So basically, there's a lot of wiggle room here on what a lawful fence can be. The fence viewers will figure out, and kind of what works for you guys. It will depend on, do you have livestock? What type of livestock it is? There's things like that. And just so you know, I just wanted to mention that there is different types of fences that are automatically approved, and that then basically there's a big catch-all provision. So besides lawful fences, there also sometimes can be the duty to keep a tight fence. And so what that means is that when a landowner has sheep or swine, if you have that, that type of livestock, you may have to keep a fence that is tight so that livestock of that size, will be maintained and kept in the premises. So that doesn't come up a lot in Iowa because we're not a big sheep producing state. The hog operations that we have are usually housed indoors. So this doesn't come up a lot. And it still can be required, though. That's something to be aware of if your neighbors do have these types of operations, if you do. So the fence viewers, if there is a dispute about the type of fence, the fence viewer they'll come out and they will also resolve this type of controversy. So that's something to kind of be aware of as well. We're going to talk about a case with miniature horses that came up, and there was no talk of tight fences then, but I'm not sure exactly what the requirement would be for something like that. But there is a duty overall. This is kind of outside of fence law, but it kind of, you can all assume that landowners and livestock owners, they have a duty. Livestock owners have to maintain their animals, or make sure they do not trespass onto other people's property. So that's a kind of a whole nother requirement, that no matter what type of fence you have, whether it's on the boundary line, whether it's not, you do have to make sure that your animals cannot get out and cause damage to other people. So the tight fence there is in the Iowa statute, there is more kind of technical requirements on what it can be. And then, as you can see, number 3 says any other kind of fence that the fence viewer is considered to be equivalent. So flexibility here, hopefully people can work it out, but I think a lot of people do like to try to resolve these issues on their own, just because it's, simpler. Hopefully it's less, friction that way. So people will definitely try to do this on their own, but I just want to bring this up so just so you guys are prepared if something does come up. So now that we've talked about, what Iowa fence law is, some of you might be thinking, if you're not livestock owners, or if you're just kind of maybe a normal person, that does the Iowa law really say this? Like, is this fair? Is this constitutional even? How can the government make me pay for my neighbor's fence? And there's a lot of controversy that comes around with it. It's like I said, it's an old law. There's a lot of phone calls we get where people are surprised by this. And so a lot of people ask, is it fair to make a neighbor pay for the cost of fencing in your livestock? And that's a great question. The Supreme Court has looked at this, and the Supreme Court has basically said, yes, that this is constitutional. So this is something that we're going to keep, and that this is from 1995, so not too recent, but in the whole history of Iowa fence law, it's a relatively recent case that the Iowa Supreme Court did declare this law to be constitutional. So we'll talk about this. This is the case where the Supreme Court said that Iowa fence law is legal, and this is the case with the miniature horses, where the plaintiffs, they lived within the city limits of the city of Tipton. They owned 12 acres, where 3 of those acres are residential and 9 were leased for crop farming. So their neighbors then were people who raised miniature horses, and they lived outside the city limits. So you can kind of imagine this. One neighbor is technically inside city limits with a row crop, and the second neighbor is outside city limits with miniature horses. So the miniature horse owners, they want a fence to keep their livestock in. And so they petitioned the plaintiffs who are inside city limits. They say, we would like to have half the cost of building this partition fence. And the city neighbors, they say, no, that is not fair. They don't have livestock. They do not want to do it. So the fence viewers get involved. The livestock owners, they must have gotten the written requests. They go through the proper channels. The fence viewers come out, and then they divide responsibility for the fences between the 2 parties. We'll talk a little bit about this at the end if we have time, what to do, because the fence viewers, if you do not like their decision, either party can challenge that, and they can, appeal this to the district court. So normally, if you have a complaint, you start with the district court in Iowa. So you go to your county court, and you will initiate a complaint there. With fence viewing, with a fence dispute, you have to start with the fence viewers, and then if you don't like their answer, you can appeal to the district court. So that's what the city neighbors did. They say, this is not fair. We're going to appeal. The county court, what they say, that this is unconstitutional. You're right. You're on city property. There's no legitimate government objective. They were thinking that the fence law is for agriculture. So then after that, the livestock owners, they appealed the district court. So it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. So our highest court in the land. And the Supreme Court said that, while a state, they cannot use its police power to benefit a particular class of people as opposed to the public generally. So states have police power, obviously, and that they can use it, but it can't just benefit farmers. It can't just benefit livestock owners. That's true. But they said that that's not what this law does. This law serves as a broader purpose of mediating boundary, fence, and trespass disputes. So they say this is good for everybody, this fence law. They say, that's why it's constitutional. And even though that these landowners in the city, the row crop operation, they still benefited, even though the livestock owners are obviously the primary beneficiary, because you can, quickly see the results of having a fence to keep livestock in. This still benefits everyone else too. And some of you are thinking, how is this true? The plaintiffs, those city landowners, they said, this is unduly oppressive. Fencing can be very expensive, and government can't just make you pay for things. But they said, the Supreme Court said this is not unduly oppressive because the cost to the landowner who doesn't necessarily want the fence, it provides so many benefits that outweigh the cost. And they said that the non-livestock owners, they get things like freedom from intrusion by livestock. So that's true. You not only have to fence in your animals, but then you also get to fence out any livestock as well. You have freedom from trespassing neighbors. So that means that less people with a fence, your neighbors can't trespass as much. They said that this law eliminates devil's lanes. If you guys have heard of those, it's where sometimes 2 neighbors who do not get along, they'll each build a fence. They'll build a fence on one on their property, one on the other, and in the middle there'll be a no man's land that nothing is used. It can be small, it can be big, and Iowa land, it's some of the most productive in the world. We want to keep it in production. So this is why we have that. We don't want to have land not in production. We want to have it used for something. So we want to eliminate devil's lanes. They said hopefully there would be less lawsuits. I don't know if that is necessarily as true too, because it seems like there still is lawsuits about this, but that's what they were hoping for. They said there would be hopefully less litigation concerning boundaries, because if people have fences on the boundary, there's no question of where the boundary is. especially in a lot of places that have, if you've inherited farms for a generation, if you have century farms, you may have always thought something was the boundary, but things may have changed in the time, or maybe the original survey done hundreds of years ago wasn't as accurate as it could be today. So hopefully we know where the fence is, or the boundary is, because of a fence. So they said that they would hope there would be less litigation. And then, like we kind of already mentioned, there would be an increase in the value of all land by fostering agriculture. So because of how productive Iowa land is, we really want to keep it in production, and fences help. Not only, there's a saying, good fences make good neighbors, and that it kind of gives some stability to people who might not otherwise know where the boundary line is, and kind of eliminate some lawsuits. So the court said that, any unfairness of this law, it is political, it's not constitutional. So if you have an issue with it, it might be a strange law, but this is something you talk to your legislature about. If they can't, the Supreme Court, the courts will not say whether they like a law, whether they think it's a good one. They just determine whether it's constitutional or legal. So if you have a problem, kind of go to you gotta change it at the legislative level. So I bring that all up to say that it kind of seems like fence law is here to stay, at least with the courts. There was an appeal as recently, I think it was 2018, 2017, so even more recently than this 1995 case, that Iowa fence law has determined to still be constitutional, despite the fact that fewer and fewer people are owning livestock. So I don't know, some people want to challenge it and bring these big lawsuits, and you can, but I don't know if it's necessarily going to change anything. It might be something we have to talk to our legislature about if you don't like it, but it does give some stability, I think, to know that it's here to stay as well. But moving on, then we will talk about fence agreements. So you can do this. It's just basically a type of a contract, kind of like an easement. So the Iowa law allows adjoining landowners to agree to what their rights and duties are concerning a fence. And this can involve, I guess I've been talking about two landowners this whole time. There can be situations where it seems like two neighbors get along. They've been maintaining the fence, sharing the responsibility for decades, years, even generations. But then all of a sudden, one of the neighbors, they end up selling their land, and it gets split up into two parts. So now the original neighbor, he will have two neighbors, one on each side, kind of, if it's split down the middle. So that is where things can get a little messy then, and you might have different agreements with different neighbors, just depending. So you can do this where different rent and fence agreements with different neighbors, but it has to be in writing. There has to be a legal description of the land, and talk about what the duties are. So you're agreeing to this. It has to be signed and then recorded. So this is very permanent. And that is why, while as great as it is to have things in writing, so you do know what your rights and duties and obligations are, because sometimes when we have agreement with someone that's verbal, we might accidentally, just not even on purpose, not exactly know. We think we mean one thing, the other party thinks they mean another. So it's great to have written things, but this is binding on you and anyone that inherits the land. So, or you sell the land too. So that's something to think of as just how permanent it is. And so if you would do something like this, I would really encourage you to seek out legal counsel to help you, because it seems like, we have calls all the time where someone, they had a family member who didn't want to spend money. Maybe it's on a will, maybe it's on a fence agreement, and they try to do something on their own. And they had great intentions, but just some technical requirement or something they didn't see because they don't make these, maybe has made it a little bit more complicated for the person. So because of how permanent these are, and it can run with the land, I would really encourage you to, while it can be a great thing, just make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. So yeah, that is one of my cautions, so that just remember that things sound great. It might be simpler to just say, I take the north half, he takes the south half, but that might not be equitable financially. So that equal distance might not really be fair. So be aware of something like that. We kind of already talked about making sure the fence is in the proper boundary line, because you can't accidentally create that boundary by acquiescence, where if the fence is on the wrong place for so long and treated like the true boundary line, it becomes the boundary line. So make sure that that is correct. You can consider, having time limits in the agreement so that if something goes, if something needs to be done, there's only so much time, so it's not so vague of what is required by each party. And then just remember that this will be binding forever. So that's why we kind of encourage people to seek out legal counsel. This is something you think that could work for you and your neighbor, but it will be permanent. So just remember that. So in the little bit of time we have left, I want to talk about fence disputes. So we've talked about what it is, kind of all these different laws that go with it. And as you can guess, this comes up a lot. So we've been mentioning these fence viewers, and fence viewers are the people, they're the township trustees, like I said, that have the power to determine any controversy that comes up under Iowa fence law. So this does not include boundary disputes. So if you have a boundary dispute, this is not a fence dispute, and that would be, a boundary dispute would be something that you talk to, that goes to the district court, so the court system right away. Fence viewers only determine duties and rights and obligations of fences. So let's say you have done, you started off right, we talked at the beginning, this written request. You do that, and then your neighbor refuses, kind of like in that Gravert case, your neighbor says no. So what do you do then? Then the complaining landowner, the one who initiated the request, they can go to the fence viewers. So the fence viewers will come, they'll resolve their dispute. They have to give a written notice. So a lot of things have to be in writing. Just remember that we don't want verbal in this case is not always okay unless you can work out something personally with your neighbor. If you're going this more formal route, things have to be in writing. So the fence viewers, they'll give 5 days, and then they will come and they will do this, they'll do a meeting and determine, what the rights and duties are of the two parties, or however many parties there are. There can be more than one, I guess. So they will come and they'll do that. And they'll try to follow the Iowa law. They'll try to do, equalize it, and it'll be kind of a technical determination. So like I said, at this meeting, what's going to happen, the fence viewers, they're going to come and they're going to just state the obligations and what of the fence. So each party, well, they'll kind of act like almost like a judicial body. They'll come, they'll be the judges, and they will decide what each party is going to be obligated to. And that is why this can be a great reason to really resolve things on your own, because you have less control. And, when you think about a lot of court cases and legal matters, a lot of people like to settle, especially in things like this, because you just don't know what a jury will think. You don't know what a judge will think. It's almost easier just to negotiate and come to something on your own. But obviously that might not always be feasible if, depending on the personalities and the people and the situation. So the fence viewers, they have some technical requirements. They will, they'll make this order, they'll sign it, and then they're going to file it with the town clerkship. So this is like a recorded written agreement then, and it's going to also be binding on you and any subsequent owners of the land. So that can be your children, your grandchildren, anyone you sell the property to ever. So this is also very permanent, like the written fence agreement, and why people should really consider, consider trying to work things out if you can. I think that's what we like to encourage as much as possible. So let's say that after this, it's kind of, again, with that Supreme Court case we talked about, the fence viewers, they're finished, they have issued their order, it's signed, it's recorded. Either party can then appeal that order to the district court, and they have 20 days to do that. So there's a few, and that is what they'll do then. If you don't have to, but if you still have issues, you can do that. And then there's a couple more requirements that the Iowa courts will require you to do. So that's what Iowa law does. And then it goes through the district court. It can go up to the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and that can get pretty expensive. But you do have some options. I bring this all up not just because I like to talk about really technical requirements with you all, but because it's kind of just how the process would work. If this was something you get into, the fence viewer's decision, while it is binding, it can be appealed. So you would have some other options with it. So that is just something to think about while just to know kind of your options when, if you are dealing with someone, some tension with your neighbor, some conflict, kind of what would happen if you cannot figure out anything. And it really is, Iowa fence law is very interesting. So this is it's technical. It's kind of, neighbor tensions can get kind of messy, but this is something that it seems like it's here to stay. So it's something we can, since it does seem permanent, we can be, planning and making good decisions based off that. So with that, that's kind of, that's my presentation. I don't know if we have any questions at all.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
Being on the border,
Mhm.
obviously between us and another state, we get a lot of, I just bought land in Iowa, or I inherited land. Where would a person start if they're planning a fence or trying to find out if there's any agreements? Where would they need to start?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I would start with like the county recorder. If they have anything, if there is an offense, that doesn't mean there necessarily was an agreement. I should say with a written fence agreement, you can change it if eventually, I guess, if both parties agree to. But if one party doesn't, you don't have to. But if you're like, if we have maybe a Nebraska, someone from Omaha or Lincoln that isn't necessarily, it was their grandparents' farm, something like that. They're not necessarily a farmer themselves. They can go talk to the county recorder. I also, just practically, it seems like people know these things. Talking to neighbors, that also kind of sometimes will turn over some stones. But definitely, if there is anything, it'd be with your county office, and I would talk to them. So, yeah. Does that make sense? So.
Yeah, it does. And so the other question I would have is for landowners who lease their farm.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be in row crops, and now they want to have livestock. What are the obligations between the landowner and the renter? Is there a different situation there, or is the landowner still required to provide that partition?
Yeah, you can contract into, usually people, what they do is that the landowners still will provide materials or the cost for it if they want to. That's kind of like the default. I feel like that's like how people operate. Well, you can contract out of that though. With farm leases, I would really encourage people to get that in writing too, so you know what you're agreeing to between the landlord and tenant, like who pays for things. We have you know this on our Ag Decision Maker. We have our farm leasing suggestions. So we have a long form, a short form of a farm lease, and that will go and say has the duties to, who's supposed to pay for the fence. Because there could obviously be some tension if someone's kind of absentee landowner. The tenant now wants to get livestock, and does the landowner have to pay for that? It's when the tenant is the one who wants to start to run cattle. That is something that should be talked about. Get that in writing so that because you don't have to do what everyone else does, but that's usually how it would work, or the landlord would provide the materials, or however that works. So
I guess my two takeaways from your talk was talk to your neighbors.
mm-hmm.
and don't have surprises. I mean, keep the communication open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Because this is kind of, a lot of people like to operate outside of this. I think a lot of Iowa landowners, they like to kind of do, they have their own agreements and they've been maybe doing something for years. This is just kind of the default. It's kind of the same with farm leases. We have a lot of technical default rules, but people, definitely talking to your neighbor first. Sometimes, practically you don't necessarily want to just send them a written request all of a sudden saying, help me build half the fence. This might be kind of a surprise to them if they don't know the law. So there's kind of the technical legal requirements, but then I think that we also should acknowledge the practical side of things as well. So yes, open communication, that's great.
And we don't have any questions, but if we do, they can contact you at the Center for Ag Law and Taxation, or they can call me here at the Extension office, and our number is 712-366-7070. Kit, thank you so much for giving us your time this morning.
Yes, thank you.
Really appreciate it. And with that, thank you and have a great weekend.
Thank you, you too.
Oh, wait, we have one question. So
Oh,
sorry.
no, you're fine. I can stay on a little bit longer. I'm gonna.
The question is, what if your neighbor is a government entity?
Okay, so I'm trying to think. Um, so if it's a government entity, like maybe you share with like a count or an office or something, that's a very good question. I have to be honest, I do not know because what you can ask the government to do is very different than what you can ask a private landowner to do. So if that is really an issue you're running into, you can feel free to email me, whoever this is, and we can check it out because there is different laws about what government agencies can be held responsible for. Oh, I see it here. Our land abuts a county lake, source of water for a town. So, let's see here. In that case, I do not know. So it would probably, I almost wonder if it would be something like the unfeasible fence situation where if it depends on where the boundary line is. I don't know if it goes, because sometimes with lakes, it seems like the boundary might go straight through the middle. I guess it would depend where it is, but that would be a good question. If you want to email me, if this is something you're seriously considering, feel free to email me. I can do some research on that because I've never had that question before. So that is a very good one. So we can definitely, or if you want to get in touch with Carol and she can get you in touch with me, we can figure that out because I'm not sure if you can require the government to do that. So yeah. So sorry, I can't answer that any better.
So their fence is, they have a fence currently, but what if it needs maintenance?
Mm-hmm. So
again, that might be a specific, we have to do some digging and some research.
Yeah, I think that is because normally if you don't have any, so if it's normally what would happen if the fence needs maintenance, someone would it depends on what part it is, because usually that right-hand rule would apply where if it's your part of the fence, you would maintain it. If it's their part, they do. But if you haven't talked to them about this yet, let's say it's their fence and you have never helped before, this might be, you have to start the conversation then you have to say, I want to be involved in this fence too, because I've had people who have called and say, my neighbor's putting up a fence, but I want some say in it because I don't like their fence. So because it doesn't work for the type of livestock I have. So sometimes you want to be involved in the fence. And you're willing to contribute half. And that's why some people do like this, that they would like to be involved. So if it needs maintenance because you want to start, getting involved in a livestock operation, if you're trying to make some changes, normally you would do the written request and say, I also want to help. But with the government, I'm not sure. So this is definitely something we can look into and get back to you with. Good question. I've never been asked that, so it's too funny.
I'll give them a minute if they have any more questions. But certainly feel free to reach out to me or reach out to Kit, and I'm sure, like you said, you'll do some digging and help with this. Oh, they say thank you. So again,
okay, good.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining. Kit, thank you so much for the great information. And everyone have a good weekend.
Yeah, thank you.